Russia is the largest country on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and covering 1/8 of the world's inhabited land.
But Russia is far more than just a giant on the map.
It is a nation forged by freezing winters that defeated invading armies, a country that launched the first human into space, and a land where ancient Orthodox cathedrals stand in the shadow of Soviet-era concrete towers. In the next 12 minutes, you will discover the Russia that few outsiders ever see: the geography, the history, the culture, and the contradictions that make this nation one of the most fascinating and misunderstood on the planet.
Russia is so vast that when the sun rises in its westernmost city of Kaliningrad, people in the eastern port of Vladivostok are already going to bed.
The country's total area exceeds 17 million square kilometers, making it almost twice the size of the United States and nearly 70 times larger than the United Kingdom. Russia shares borders with 14 countries, more than any other nation, including Norway, China, North Korea, and the United States, just 4 kilometers apart across the Bering Strait.
Its geography is a study in extremes.
In the north, the Siberian tundra is a frozen wilderness where winter temperatures regularly plunge below -50 degrees Celsius and the ground remains permanently frozen in what scientists call permafrost. This permafrost layer covers 65% of Russian territory and in some places extends more than a kilometer deep. In the south, along the Black Sea coast, the subtropical resort city of Sochi enjoys palm trees and warm summers, a stark contrast to the Arctic cold just a few thousand kilometers away. The Russian landscape is defined by enormous rivers. The Volga, Europe's longest, flows over 3,500 kilometers from the Valdai Hills to the Caspian Sea and is often called Mother Volga in Russian folklore. The Yenisei, the Lena, and the Ob rivers of Siberia are among the 10 largest rivers on Earth by discharge, yet they flow through regions so sparsely populated that most of the world has never heard of them.
And then there is Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, a natural wonder that defies belief.
Baikal is the world's deepest lake at over 1,600 meters, and it holds 23% of all the fresh surface water on the planet, more than all 5 of the North American Great Lakes combined. The lake contains thousands of unique species found nowhere else on Earth, including the Baikal seal, the only exclusively freshwater seal in the world. The water is so pure that in winter, you can see more than 40 meters below the surface through the crystal clear ice.
Russia's history is no less dramatic than its geography.
The story begins in the 9th century when Viking traders known as the Rus traveled down the rivers of Eastern Europe and established the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic and Finnic peoples centered on the city of Kiev. In 988, Prince Vladimir the Great made the momentous decision to adopt Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, a choice that shaped Russian art, architecture, and identity for the next 1,000 years. The 13th century brought disaster. The Mongol Empire under Bata Khan swept across the steppe and destroyed city after city, establishing what Russians called a Tatar yoke, a period of Mongol domination that lasted 2.5 centuries and cut Russia off from the cultural and scientific advances of the European Renaissance.
Moscow rose from the ashes of the Mongol period.
In 1480, Grand Prince Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, formally ended Mongol rule and began consolidating power around the Principality of Moscow, laying the foundations of the Russian state. A century later, his grandson Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, became the first ruler to crown himself Tsar of all Russia. His reign swung between brilliant military conquests and paranoid brutality, setting a pattern of strongman rule that would echo through Russian history for centuries. The year 1613 brought the Romanov dynasty to power, and under Peter the Great, Russia was transformed. Peter traveled incognito to Western Europe, learned shipbuilding in the Netherlands, and returned determined to drag his vast medieval kingdom into the modern world. He built a new capital city, St. Petersburg, on swampland along the Baltic Sea, a window to the west, as he called it, and reformed the military, the government, and even the way Russians dressed, famously imposing a tax on beards to force Western fashion upon his court. The 19th century saw Russia reach its imperial peak under Catherine the Great, who expanded the empire into Crimea, the Caucasus, and Central Asia.
Yet even as the empire grew, the seeds of its destruction were being sown.
Russia remained a feudal society where the vast majority of the population were serfs, peasants bound to the land and owned by noble landlords. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom, but the reforms came too late and too slowly to satisfy a population hungry for change. The Industrial Revolution arrived late to Russia, creating overcrowded cities and a restless working class that increasingly turned to radical ideas, including the writings of a German philosopher named Karl Marx. The year 1917 changed everything. World War I had exposed the incompetence of the Romanov regime, with millions of poorly equipped Russian soldiers dying on the Eastern Front while the Tsar remained oblivious at court. In February, street protests and mutinies forced Nicholas II to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. But the provisional government that replaced him proved just as incapable of ending the war or feeding the cities.
8 months later, in October, the Bolshevik Party under Vladimir Lenin seized power in a nearly bloodless coup. The Soviet Union, the world's first communist state, was born.
What followed was a brutal civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-communist White Forces, a conflict that claimed more than 7 million lives before the Reds emerged victorious in 1922.
Under Joseph Stalin, who emerged as Lenin's successor after a ruthless power struggle, the Soviet Union underwent a transformation as rapid as it was violent.
Stalin's 5-year plans forcibly industrialized the country at breakneck speed, building factories and dams and entire new cities from scratch. Collectivization of agriculture, intended to feed this new industrial workforce, instead produced a man-made famine in Ukraine and southern Russia known as the Holodomor, in which an estimated 4 million people starved to death. The Great Purge of the late 1930s saw Stalin eliminate any perceived rival or threat. Military officers, party officials, scientists, poets, hundreds of thousands were executed, and millions more sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps stretching across Siberia. Yet when Nazi Germany invaded in June 1941, it was the same Soviet Union that absorbed the blow, suffered catastrophic losses of over 27 million citizens, and ultimately broke the back of Hitler's war machine at Stalingrad and Kursk before raising the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Soviet sacrifice in what Russians call the Great Patriotic War remains a deeply sacred national memory to this day. The Cold War that followed pitted the Soviet Union against the United States in a contest for global dominance that lasted over 40 years. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, shocking the world and demonstrating technological prowess that few had suspected. 4 years later, in 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth, a triumph that remains one of the proudest moments in Russian history. But the command economy that achieved these spectacular successes proved incapable of providing the basic consumer goods and living standards that ordinary citizens expected. By the 1980s, the system was visibly cracking. When Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to reform it with glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, he unleashed forces that he could not control. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and on Christmas Day 1991, the Red Hammer encyclical flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union was no more. The Russia that emerged in the post-Soviet 1990s was chaotic and often tragic. Shock therapy economic reforms produced hyperinflation that wiped out the lifetime savings of millions, while a handful of well-connected oligarchs acquired the state's most valuable industries for pennies. Poverty, crime, and a collapse in life expectancy marked what many Russians remember as a lost decade. The turn of the millennium brought a new strongman, Vladimir Putin, who promised order and the restoration of national pride. Under Putin, a booming oil and gas economy fueled a dramatic rise in living standards through the 2000s, and Russia reasserted itself on the world stage. But over time, the political system tightened, opposition was suppressed, and relations with the West deteriorated through a series of crises: the 2008 war with Georgia, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which triggered the most severe confrontation between Russia and the West since the darkest days of the Cold War. Russian culture is one of the richest and most profound in human history. In literature, the 19th century produced an almost unbelievable concentration of genius: Leo Tolstoy, whose War and Peace is regularly described as the greatest novel ever written; Fyodor Dostoevsky, who explored the darkest corners of the human psyche in Crime and Punishment; and the brothers Karamazov; Anton Chekhov, the master of the short story in modern theater; and Alexander Pushkin, the national poet whose verse remains memorized by Russian schoolchildren to this day. In music, Pyotr Tchaikovsky composed the 1812 overture in Swan Lake, Igor Stravinsky revolutionized classical music with The Rite of Spring, and Dmitri Shostakovich wrote symphonies under siege, literally, composing his 7th symphony while his city of Leningrad was surrounded by Nazi forces. In ballet, the Bolshoi and the Mariinsky set the global standard, with dancers like Rudolf Nureyev and Mikhail Baryshnikov becoming international legends. In chess, Soviet and Russian grandmasters dominated the world championship for most of the 20th century, from Mikhail Botvinnik to Garry Kasparov. Modern Russia is a country of contradictions. Its cities are filled with hyper-modern technology. Moscow's metro system is one of the most beautiful and efficient in the world, carrying over 6 million passengers daily through stations that resemble underground palaces decorated with marble, mosaics, and chandeliers. Russia has one of the highest rates of university education in the world, and its tech sector produces world-class software engineers and mathematicians. Yet outside the major cities, many rural villages still lack indoor plumbing and reliable roads. Winter remains a defining fact of life. Russians have a saying: there is no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, and the ability to endure harsh conditions is a point of deep national pride. The Russian soul, a concept endlessly debated by philosophers and writers, refers to a perceived national character of depth, melancholy, resilience, and a capacity for both great cruelty and profound compassion. As you finish watching this video, consider a few things that make Russia truly unique. It is the only country that spans 2 continents in its cultural and demographic core. It possesses the world's largest reserves of natural gas and some of the largest reserves of oil, coal, diamonds, and timber on the planet, making it a natural resource superpower whose economy remains heavily dependent on extracting and exporting these raw materials. Its space program, successor to the Soviet one, still launches astronauts from the same Baikonur cosmodrome where Gagarin lifted off. Its nuclear arsenal, the largest in the world, is a legacy of the Cold War that continues to shape global geopolitics. And its people, spread across a land so vast that a train journey from Moscow to Vladivostok on the Trans-Siberian Railway takes 7 full days, remain bound together by a shared language, a shared history, and a shared endurance that no foreign power has ever managed to break.
The Trans-Siberian Railway is worth a moment of special attention.
Stretching 9,289 kilometers from Moscow to Vladivostok, it is the longest railway line on Earth. Construction began in 1891 under Tsar Alexander III and was completed under his son Nicholas II in 1916. The railway crosses 8 time zones, passes through 87 cities and towns, and crosses 16 major rivers, including the Volga and the Ob. It was this railway that opened up Siberia, allowing settlers to flood eastward in the late 19th century and transforming what had been a remote wilderness into an integral part of the Russian state. Today, the journey is a bucket list experience for travelers from around the world, offering a week-long immersion into the sheer scale and diversity of the Russian landscape.
In the end, Russia defies easy summary.
It is a country of orthodox onion domes and Soviet brutalist apartment blocks. A place where babushkas sell homegrown vegetables outside metro stations while young programmers build billion-dollar tech startups. A nation that produced some of the most beautiful art and literature in human history, and also some of its most repressive political systems. It is a land of white nights in St. Petersburg during the summer, where the sun barely sets for weeks, and of the polar night in Murmansk, where it does not rise at all for 40 days in winter. Russia is not a problem to be solved or a puzzle to be understood, it is a world unto itself, vast, contradictory, and endlessly compelling. Thank you for spending these 12 minutes exploring it with us, and if you enjoyed this journey, we invite you to explore the rest of our Every Country Explained series right here on TrendLens.